Emily had always considered herself to be a rational, level-headed woman. She prided herself on her ability to juggle a successful career with the demands of family life. She and David had been married for over 10 years, and in that time, their relationship had seemed solid. They had 2 children, Megan, who was 8, and Jake, who was 6. And they were an ordinary suburban family. David had always been a reliable, loving husband, and Emily had never questioned his loyalty or commitment. Until now. It started innocuously enough. Emily was sorting through some old financial records, organizing things for tax season. She had always taken charge of their finances, a responsibility that David never seemed interested in. As she sifted through papers, one item caught her attention: a receipt for a vacation booking. It was dated just a few months ago. But what caught Emily off guard was the fact that David had gone on the trip alone. At first, she thought nothing of it. Perhaps it was a work trip he had forgotten to mention, or some other excuse. But as she examined the receipt further, she noticed something strange. The destination listed on the ticket was not somewhere David had ever mentioned. The hotel was in a city several hours away from where they lived, a city that Emily knew nothing about. Curious, she looked closer. The booking had been made under a name that was unfamiliar to her. Sarah Williams. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The name rang a faint bell, but she couldn't immediately place it. It was possible that Sarah was a colleague or a business contact, but why hadn't David mentioned her before? Emily's mind raced, but she tried to stay calm. She decided to investigate further. Over the next few days, Emily found herself obsessing over the name. She Googled Sarah Williams, trying to see if she could uncover anything about her. There were several people with that name, but one of them seemed to be a potential match. She found a profile on a social media site, and when she clicked on it, Emily's breath caught in her throat. There, in the profile picture, was a woman who looked strikingly familiar to her. A woman who, in fact, bore a striking resemblance to herself. The same light brown hair, the same sharp features. And the more Emily scrolled through Sarah's posts, the more unsettling it became. There were pictures of Sarah with a family, children who appeared to be the same age as her own. But what struck Emily the most was the caption on one particular photo: "A beautiful weekend getaway with my amazing husband." The name of the man beside Sarah was none other than David. Emily's world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her stomach churned as she read through the post again, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The realization hit her like a freight train. David had been living a double life. He had another family. This woman, Sarah, was not just some acquaintance. She was David's wife. And those children in the photos. Emily's mind was reeling. Those were David's children too. How had she not known? How had she not seen the signs? Emily sat in her office, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest. She felt sick to her stomach, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Her mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it an affair that had turned into something more? Had he been lying to her for years? She thought of their marriage, of all the moments they had shared, all the times David had assured her of his love and loyalty. It all felt like a lie now, like a cruel joke she had been too blind to see. Her initial shock gave way to a growing sense of anger. She could feel the betrayal burning inside her, consuming her thoughts. But she didn't want to jump to conclusions. She needed answers. She needed to confront him. That evening, when David came home from work, Emily's heart was pounding. She had spent the entire day stewing in her thoughts. But now that the moment had arrived, she felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. As he walked in the door, she stood up, her face an unreadable mask. "David," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He looked at her, sensing something was off. "Hey Em, how was your day?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the receipts and printouts from her desk drawer and slammed them down in front of him. David looked at them, his face faltering for a moment. The receipt, the name, the vacation. It was all there in black and white. "Who is Sarah Williams?" Emily asked, her voice low but edged with a quiet fury. David froze, his expression flickering with surprise. He swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb, David," Emily snapped. "I know everything." David hesitated, looking between Emily and the papers in front of him. His face slowly drained of color, and for the first time in their marriage, Emily saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Emily, I didn't want to hurt you, David said, his voice trembling slightly. Didn't want to hurt me? Emily repeated, her voice rising. You've been lying to me, to our children, to both of us. How long, David? How long have you been lying? David looked down at the floor, and Emily could see the shame written across his face. After a long pause, he spoke. For 5 years, he said quietly. Emily's heart shattered at his words. 5 years. 5 years of betrayal. Of sharing a life with her while also building another with Sarah. He had been playing both sides, living a lie that she had never suspected. 5 years. She whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. How could you do this? To me, to our family? David looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. It wasn't planned, Emily. I never meant for it to happen like this. I met Sarah a few years ago, and things just happened. I never meant for it to get so complicated. Complicated? Emily repeated incredulously. You've been married to her, David. You have children with her. And you think that's just complicated? What about us? What about this family? David took a step toward her, reaching out as if to comfort her. But Emily stepped back, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of everything crashing down on her. All the years of their marriage, all the love and trust she had given him, had been built on a lie. She couldn't even look at him anymore. He wasn't the man she had married. He was someone else entirely. A stranger who had destroyed everything they had built together. I'm so sorry, Emily, David said softly, his voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know who you are anymore, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to believe. You've betrayed me in the worst possible way. There was a long silence between them, and for a moment Emily considered walking away, packing her things and leaving him for good. But she needed to understand the full extent of the betrayal. She needed to know the truth. Who else knows? She asked, her voice cold. David seemed to hesitate. No one, he finally admitted. No one knows about Sarah. Except for the people in her life. I've kept them separate. I've tried to keep it all secret. Why? Emily asked, feeling both angry and defeated. Why keep us apart? Why not just tell me the truth from the beginning? I didn't know how, David admitted, his voice small. I didn't want to lose you, Emily. I didn't know what to do. Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. She felt lost, betrayed, and utterly heartbroken. How had this happened? How had David, the man she had trusted more than anyone, been capable of such deceit? For the first time in years, she didn't know who she was looking at. This man, this stranger standing in front of her, had shattered everything. And she had no idea where to go from here. I need time, Emily said finally, her voice steady but full of pain. I need to think. David nodded, but she could see the guilt and fear in his eyes. The damage had already been done. And no matter what he said or did now, their marriage would never be the same. The days following Emily's discovery were a blur, each moment more painful than the last. David's apology rang hollow in her mind, and every word he spoke seemed to create a deeper chasm between them. As much as he pleaded, as much as he apologized, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The life they had built, the family they had created, suddenly felt like an elaborate lie. Every interaction, every moment they had shared, now felt tainted by the truth she had uncovered. In the silence of their home, Emily was left alone with her thoughts. The quiet seemed louder than ever, a constant reminder of the unspoken tension that hung between them. Their children, oblivious to the storm that had erupted in their home, carried on with their daily routines. Megan had a soccer practice that afternoon, and Jake was preparing for a school field trip. As Emily watched them go about their business, a deep sadness washed over her. The innocence in their faces contrasted with the weight of the realization that their father, the man who had always been their protector, had deceived not only her but them as well. She spent the following day in a daze, barely able to concentrate on anything. Her mind kept returning to the images of Sarah, the other woman, who had been living a parallel life. Emily had seen Sarah's social media posts, but they felt distant, like an unsettling dream she couldn't shake. She couldn't understand how David had managed to maintain both families for so long. How had he hidden this from her? How had she, someone who prided herself on being observant, missed the signs? The next morning, Emily did what she had sworn to herself she would never do. She reached out to Sarah. The decision wasn't easy, but it seemed necessary. After all, Sarah had a right to know that she wasn't the only one who had been deceived. Emily's hands trembled as she typed out the message, each word feeling like a betrayal of its own. But it was the only way forward. The only way to make sense of the mess David had created. Hello, Sarah. My name is Emily, and I believe we have something in common. I'm married to David. I know about you, and I'm sorry for the way this is happening, but I think it's time we speak. She hesitated for a moment before pressing send. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the screen. She didn't know what to expect. Would Sarah respond with anger? Would she deny everything? Or worse, would she be as shocked and confused as Emily had been when she first uncovered the truth? The response came much sooner than Emily had anticipated. Within minutes, Sarah had replied, her message short but heavy with emotion. Emily, I had a feeling. I really had a feeling. Let's talk. The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. There was a strange sense of relief in hearing that Sarah had suspected something all along. At least Emily wasn't the only one who had been kept in the dark. But the acknowledgement of Sarah's own pain made Emily feel even worse. She wasn't alone in this betrayal, but that didn't make the situation any easier. They agreed to meet at a local coffee shop the following day. Emily couldn't bring herself to tell David what she was planning. She didn't feel ready to confront him again, not yet. The thought of facing him made her feel nauseous. He had already broken her trust in the most profound way, and now the idea of speaking with Sarah seemed like the only way to regain some semblance of control. Emily needed answers, and Sarah, as much as it hurt, was the person who could provide them. The next day, Emily arrived at the coffee shop early, her nerves making her feel jittery. She ordered a coffee and found a quiet corner table, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't know what to expect from this meeting. She didn't know if Sarah would be kind, angry, or simply numb from the same emotional toll that Emily had been experiencing. But she knew one thing: they needed to talk. When Sarah entered, Emily immediately recognized her. She was taller than Emily had imagined, with dark hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She was dressed simply in a beige sweater and jeans, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Emily feel a strange sense of empathy. Sarah hesitated for a moment, scanning the room, and when their eyes met, there was no need for words. They both understood the gravity of the situation. Emily? Sarah's voice was soft, tentative, but there was something raw in it, something vulnerable. Emily nodded, and they exchanged an awkward handshake before sitting down. Thank you for meeting me, Emily said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil inside her. I didn't know who else to turn to. I'm glad you reached out, Sarah said quietly. Honestly, I've been trying to make sense of everything too. I've suspected for a while that something wasn't right. But I didn't know. I didn't know this. The two women sat in silence for a few moments, each processing the emotions swirling within them. Emily felt the weight of the situation, the enormity of what they were both facing. David's lies had been like a slow burn, each day adding another layer of betrayal. But now, in the presence of Sarah, Emily realized just how deep the deception had gone. I don't know where to start, Sarah said, breaking the silence. But I guess I should tell you a bit about myself. I met David 5 years ago. We were both in a tough spot in our lives. He was going through a rough patch with work, and I had just come out of a bad relationship. We connected quickly, and things escalated fast. We got married less than a year after we met. Emily listened intently, her emotions a whirl of disbelief and sorrow. Sarah had married David so quickly, just as Emily had. They had both been swept up in the promise of love and companionship, only to find themselves abandoned by the same man. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of kinship with Sarah, as if they were both victims of a shared nightmare. David promised me everything, Sarah continued, her voice shaking. He told me that I was the one he had been waiting for, that he'd never felt this way about anyone before. He said I was his soulmate, just like he must have told you. Emily nodded. He did. He told me the same things. He made me believe in him, in us, in the future we were building together. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. I don't know what to believe anymore. I've been so angry with him, but at the same time, I feel so betrayed. How could he do this? To both of us? I don't know, Emily said softly, the sadness in her voice echoing Sarah's own. I don't understand how he could do this to me. To you. To our children. They both fell silent again, the weight of their shared pain hanging heavily between them. Emily couldn't help but feel a strange sense of solidarity with Sarah. They were both mothers, both wives, both women who had been deceived by the same man. They were connected now in a way that neither of them had ever anticipated. I'm sorry, Sarah said finally, wiping her eyes. I didn't want to be the other woman. I never wanted this to happen. I thought I was the one he wanted. I thought I was enough for him. You are enough, Emily said, surprising herself with her words. We both were. He was the one who wasn't enough. He was the one who lied to both of us. The words felt bitter in her mouth, but there was a strange sense of comfort in them. For the first time since she had discovered David's betrayal, Emily didn't feel so alone. She wasn't the only one in this. She wasn't the only one he had deceived. I don't know what to do, Sarah admitted. I feel like I'm losing everything. My life is a lie. Emily could relate. Her own world had been upended in an instant, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. But despite the chaos, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let David's actions define her. She wasn't going to let him destroy her or her family. I think we need to confront him, Emily said quietly. We need to make him face what he's done. He can't keep running away from this. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination. You're right. He can't keep hiding. We both deserve answers. They sat in silence for a few moments, each woman lost in her own thoughts. Emily knew that confronting David would not be easy. It would not be a simple conversation. But it was the only way forward. For herself, for her children, for Sarah, and for her own peace of mind. I'll stand by you, Emily said softly. We'll do this together. We'll make him take responsibility. Sarah smiled weakly, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I would have done without you. They both knew the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time since discovering the truth, Emily felt a flicker of hope. They were not alone in this. Together, they would face the man who had deceived them both. And together, they would reclaim their lives. The days leading up to their meeting had been a mix of anticipation and dread. Emily had never thought that she would find herself in a position like this. Meeting the woman who had shared the same man, the same life. A part of her wanted to delay it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but the other part, the part that refused to let David's lies continue controlling her life, knew that this confrontation was inevitable. She had to do it. For her own peace of mind, for her children, and for Sarah. The coffee shop where they had agreed to meet was a small, cozy place on a quiet corner in the city. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of pastries. Emily had arrived early, sitting at a table by the window. Her hands were folded in front of her, but her fingers twitched nervously. Every time the door opened, her heart skipped a beat. She kept telling herself that this meeting was important, that it was a necessary step. But it didn't stop the fear that gripped her chest whenever she thought of facing Sarah, the woman who had been unknowingly walking the same path as her for so long. She looked out the window, watching the rain start to fall, soft droplets tapping against the glass. It felt like the world outside mirrored the storm brewing inside her. The rain made everything feel heavier, more real, like the weight of the situation had been amplified by the weather. The door chimed as it opened, and Emily's gaze immediately shot to the figure entering. David, he told me you were his soulmate, Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. He said he never felt this way about anyone else. He made me believe it. I really thought he was mine, that I was his future. Sarah's voice cracked, and for the first time, Emily saw a flash of raw emotion, something more vulnerable than what she had expected. But now I feel like a fool. I don't really know how to do this, Emily. I didn't expect any of this. She paused, her eyes darting to the table, avoiding Emily's gaze. I didn't want any of it. Emily's chest tightened, but she didn't speak immediately. She needed to hear Sarah out. She had so many questions, so many things she wanted to say, but right now she needed to listen. There was no mistaking it. Sarah walked in, hesitated for a moment as if unsure whether to approach, and then locked eyes with Emily. She wasn't exactly what Emily had expected. Sarah was taller than her, with deep brown eyes that had a certain weariness to them. She looked exhausted, the lines of stress evident on her face, but her posture was strong. There was a quiet resilience about her. For a long moment neither woman moved. They both stood still, almost as if the weight of the moment had paralyzed them. Then Sarah slowly walked over to the table, offering Emily a tentative smile. "Emily?" Sarah's voice was quiet, almost uncertain. Emily nodded and stood up, her legs shaky as she extended her hand. "Yes. It's good to meet you," she said, her voice betraying the calm facade she tried to maintain. There was an awkward silence as the two women sat down. Neither knew exactly where to start. The tension between them was palpable, like a rope tugging them in opposite directions, and both felt the enormity of the moment. Emily could feel her heart racing, every part of her wanting to scream at Sarah, to demand answers. But she held herself back. This wasn't Sarah's fault, and screaming at her wouldn't change anything. David was the one who had built this mess, not Sarah. The silence stretched on longer than either of them had anticipated. Emily found herself staring into her coffee cup, unsure of what to say. It felt so unnatural to be here, to be sitting across from the woman who had shared a life with her husband. And yet in some strange way it felt necessary. They needed to talk. They needed to share their pain and confusion. Maybe, just maybe, understanding each other would give them both some closure, some semblance of peace. Finally Sarah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could I have been so blind?" Emily felt a pang of sympathy for Sarah, even as her own anger bubbled beneath the surface. Sarah had been deceived just as she had. They had both been told the same lies, made to believe in a future that was nothing but smoke and mirrors. Emily swallowed hard, her voice soft as she spoke. "He told me the same thing. For years, he told me I was his one and only, that we were building a life together." The room seemed to grow colder as the weight of their shared pain hung in the air. They were two women who had unknowingly been led down the same dark path, both of them trapped in the lies David had spun so effortlessly. It was hard to look at Sarah without seeing the same pain in her eyes that Emily felt in her own heart. But in that moment, Emily realized something. This wasn't about Sarah. This wasn't about blaming her for everything that had gone wrong. This was about David. It had always been about him. "How long have you known?" Emily asked, her voice calm, but laced with the anger she could no longer suppress. Sarah looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time since they had sat down. "I suspected something for a while," she admitted, "but I didn't know for sure until recently. There were little things, you know? He'd be gone for days, sometimes weeks, and he'd have excuses, but they never seemed to add up. And then I found out about you." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I confronted him, but he denied everything. He swore it was nothing. He said I was being paranoid." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Paranoid? That's what he told you?" Sarah nodded. "Yes. And I wanted to believe him. I really did. But there were too many inconsistencies, too many lies." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I should have trusted my instincts. But I wanted to believe in him, in us." There was a long pause as both women absorbed each other's words. Emily could see the conflict in Sarah's eyes, the same struggle she herself had faced in trying to reconcile the image of the man they both loved with the truth of who he really was. It was hard to accept, hard to understand how someone could maintain such a complicated web of lies for so long. "I don't know what to do," Sarah whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "I feel so lost. My whole world is falling apart, and I don't even know where to start." Emily's heart ached for Sarah, but she couldn't let herself get too caught up in her own empathy. She needed to stay focused. They needed answers, and the only person who could give them those answers was David. "We need to confront him," Emily said firmly. "We need to make him face what he's done. He can't keep running from this." Sarah nodded, her face a mixture of anger and resolve. "I agree. He needs to answer for all of this." There was another long pause before Emily spoke again. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I don't mean to sound harsh. I know this is hard for you too. But we need to stop him from continuing this. We can't let him keep playing both of us like this." "I understand," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I don't want to be the other woman anymore. I don't want to be lied to. to live in a shadow of someone else's life. The determination in Sarah's voice was something Emily had never expected. She had thought Sarah might be angry, perhaps defensive, but instead, Sarah seemed to understand that this wasn't about blaming each other. This was about holding David accountable for the chaos he had created. "Do you think he'll tell us the truth?" Emily asked, the question heavy in the air. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice tight. "But he has to. We've both been living in his lies long enough." Emily's hands clenched into fists. The anger inside her was impossible to ignore now. She had spent so much time trying to make sense of David's betrayal, but now it was clear. She wasn't going to let him continue manipulating them. She wasn't going to let him escape responsibility. "I'm not going to let him keep controlling this," Emily said firmly. "We deserve better. We deserve the truth." Sarah's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Emily saw something that resembled hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. They were both standing on the edge of something monumental, something terrifying. But together, they might be able to face the truth and rebuild their lives. As they sat there in the quiet coffee shop, Emily realized that this was no longer just about David. It was about them, about reclaiming their lives, their dignity, and their futures. And no matter what happened next, Emily knew that she wouldn't be walking through this storm alone. She had Sarah now. They had each other. And that, in the end, might be enough to face whatever came next. It had been a week since Emily and Sarah had met at the coffee shop. The initial awkwardness and uncertainty between them had dissipated, replaced by a kind of solidarity. Neither of them had expected to find common ground in such an unimaginable situation, but here they were. Two women who had been unknowingly trapped in a web of lies spun by the same man. Together, they had decided that it was time to confront David. It was no longer enough to sit in silence, or let him continue with his deceit. Both women deserved answers. Both women needed to know the truth. Emily had not spoken to David since that dreadful night, when she had discovered the truth. For a week, she had remained distant, silent, hoping for a sign from him, some kind of explanation. But nothing had come. He had avoided her, as if pretending it hadn't happened would somehow make the reality disappear. Every time she thought about him, she felt a rush of anger and confusion. How had he done this? How had he so easily betrayed her, their children, and Sarah? Was he truly so consumed by his own desires that he could deceive two women so thoroughly? It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the lies, the years of pretending, the broken trust. David had taken so much from her. And now she was forced to rebuild her life from the ruins he had left behind. Sarah, on the other hand, had been wrestling with her own demons. The day after their coffee shop meeting, she had gone home to confront David. But instead of the confrontation she had hoped for, David had deflected, pushing the blame back onto her. He had apologized, of course, in a way that felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced his words in front of a mirror. He had claimed that he never wanted to hurt her, that he was simply confused and struggling. But Sarah wasn't naive. She had heard these excuses before, from men in her past who had used similar words to justify their actions. She wasn't going to let him talk his way out of this. That same night, she had called Emily again. The anger in Sarah's voice was palpable, but so was the resolve. She told Emily that she was ready, that they couldn't wait any longer. They needed to make David face the truth together. It had been agreed. The three of them would meet at David's apartment. He still lived in the same place he had shared with Emily before the affair had come to light. Emily had asked him to meet there, to give them the opportunity to have it out with him. And now, the moment had arrived. Emily arrived at David's apartment with her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, but nothing could have prepared her for the confrontation that was about to unfold. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a reckoning. A part of her wanted to turn back, to avoid the confrontation, to escape the inevitable pain. But she couldn't. She had already waited too long. She had to know the truth. The apartment door opened and there stood David. He was as handsome as ever, his dark hair slightly tousled, his eyes wide with surprise when he saw Emily standing there. But when he saw Sarah behind her, his expression faltered. For a split second, Emily thought she saw a flash of guilt in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by a smirk. "Emily," he said. his voice attempting to sound calm but betraying the tension that crackled between them. "What is this? What are you doing here?" His voice, once so reassuring, now sounded distant, almost foreign. Emily didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She had something far more important to say than to engage in his empty pleasantries. Instead, Sarah spoke, her voice firm. "We need to talk, David." David's eyes flicked from Sarah to Emily and back again, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation. "I don't know what you're both doing here, but I don't have time for this. I've already apologized, Emily. You don't need to drag this out any longer." Emily could feel the anger building up inside her, but she held herself steady. "You don't get to hide behind your apologies anymore. You've done enough damage." Emily's eyes locked onto David's. "You've been living a lie, David. You've been lying to both of us. And we deserve answers. How could you do this to us?" She was done with his excuses. "No, David," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "This is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to drag it out. We're going to talk. You're going to listen. You owe us both that much." David took a step back, clearly taken aback by Emily's tone. He had expected the confrontation to be more subdued, less direct. But this was different. Emily was no longer the quiet, understanding wife who had always tried to see the best in him. She had seen the truth. And now, she wasn't backing down. "Emily, I'm sorry, okay? How could you betray us both for so long?" David shifted uneasily, his eyes avoiding theirs. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Emily could feel her patience thinning. "No, it was exactly like that. You made a choice. I'm sorry for everything. I made a mistake. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," David began, his voice attempting to sound remorseful. But it was as if the words were being pulled from him reluctantly. "No, David," Sarah interjected sharply. "Don't do that. Don't give us that same story. We've heard it before. You chose to lie. You chose to deceive. You knew exactly what you were doing. And you thought you could get away with it." Sarah stepped forward now, her eyes hard. "What Emily is saying is true. You made us both believe that we were the only one. You made us think we were special. And in the end, we were just part of your games." David finally looked at them both, his face pale. There was no deflecting now. The reality of the situation was setting in. "I don't know what you want from me. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you both." "You already did," Emily said sharply. "But it's not just about us, David. It's about our kids. You lied to our children. You told them we were a family. You told them you were committed to us. And all along, you were living a double life. Do you have any idea what that does to them? To their trust in you?" David's expression faltered at the mention of their children. For a moment his gaze softened, but it was fleeting. His remorse felt shallow, as if he was only sorry now because he had been caught, not because he truly understood the depth of the harm he had caused. Sarah crossed her arms. "We're done with your excuses. We both know you'll never change. You'll never be the man we thought you were. And frankly, we don't want you to be." Emily nodded. "This is over, David. I'm done. We're both done." David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if the realization of what had happened finally hit him. For the first time, he saw the consequences of his actions staring back at him, not in the form of angry words, but in the silent strength of the two women before him. Emily and Sarah were no longer passive victims of his manipulation. They were taking control. And in that moment, David realized he had no power left. Sarah's voice broke through the silence. "I hope one day you can look at yourself and see the damage you've done. But right now, we don't need you. We're moving on. And we don't need you in our lives anymore." Emily turned to leave. But then she paused, looking back at David one final time. She had been through so much heartbreak and betrayal. But in this moment, she felt a sense of finality. She wasn't walking away in defeat. She was walking away with her head held high, with the strength to move forward. "I hope you can find a way to make peace with what you've done," Emily said softly. "But that's your journey now, not ours." And with that, Emily and Sarah left David standing in his apartment, the man who had once held so much power over them now nothing more than a ghost of the past. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed in the empty apartment. As they stepped into the cool evening air, the weight on their shoulders began to lift. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that they were going to be okay. Sarah's presence beside her was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. They were in this together, and together they would rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be difficult days ahead. But Emily had learned something in the weeks since the truth had come to light. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever realized. And she would never again let anyone, least of all David, define her. Together they walked away, leaving the past behind, ready to embrace whatever the future held. It was a new beginning, not just for Emily, but for both of them. They had been through the storm, but now the skies were clearing, and the road ahead was theirs to take. And with that, they walked into the future together.